Some things should never be heard, especially when you're alone. It was a quiet autumn night, and I was staying in an old inn just off a forgotten road. The place was quaint, but it carried an unsettling stillness, the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. I was the only guest that night, or so the receptionist told me. My room was at the end of a long hallway, dimly lit by flickering sconces, the kind of light that plays tricks on your eyes. I had just settled into bed when I heard it, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks of the old wooden walls, but then it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind, it was a voice. The whisper came from the hallway, soft but clear, like someone standing just outside my door. "Let me in," it said. I froze, clutching the blanket tighter. The door was locked. I made sure of it, but the sound didn't stop. "Let me in," the voice repeated, more insistent this time. I got up, every muscle in my body tense, and tiptoed to the door. Pressing my ear against the wood, I listened. Nothing. Just silence. Then, three soft knocks. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move, didn't even blink. Suddenly the whisper was inside the room, right behind me. "You shouldn't have listened," it hissed. I turned, but there was no one there. The room was empty. The light above me flickered once, then went out. I don't remember running out of the room, but I found myself outside the inn, gasping for air under the cold night sky. The receptionist was gone. The inn, dark and silent, looked abandoned, as if no one had stayed there for years. Have you ever heard something you shouldn't have? If so, share your story in the comments. And don't close your eyes just yet. The next story will leave you breathless. There are nights you wish you could forget, nights that make you question everything you believe in. For me, that night happened in early January, during one of the coldest winters I can remember. I was alone in a cabin deep in the woods. It belonged to my late uncle, who had left it to the family. The cabin was isolated with no neighbors for miles, accessible only by a narrow, snow-covered road. I went there to escape the chaos of the city, thinking the quiet would clear my mind. I had no idea what was waiting for me. The first night was peaceful. I lit the fireplace, made myself a cup of tea, and sat in an old armchair with a book. The silence of the woods was comforting, almost hypnotic. But on the second night, everything changed. It started with a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the windows. But as the minutes passed, the sound became more rhythmic. It was a faint tapping, like someone gently knocking on the glass. I froze, my eyes darting to the nearest window. Outside, it was pitch black, the kind of darkness where even the moonlight couldn't penetrate. I tried convincing myself it was just a tree branch brushing against the cabin, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The tapping stopped. I exhaled, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just my imagination. Then I heard it again, this time from the opposite side of the cabin. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked slowly to the kitchen window. The tapping grew louder as I got closer. My breath fogged the glass as I leaned in, trying to see through the darkness. And then I saw it. A face. It was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. The mouth was twisted into a faint, unnatural smile. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair. When I looked again, the face was gone. I locked every door and window, my hands trembling. The old cabin groaned as the wind picked up, and the tapping started again, this time on multiple windows at once. I didn't know what to do. My phone had no signal, and the nearest town was miles away. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then, the lights went out. The darkness was suffocating. I fumbled for the flashlight I had left on the coffee table, my breath coming in shallow gasps. That's when I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy, as if someone or something was walking across the wooden floor. But I was alone. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. The footsteps stopped. and for a brief moment everything was silent. Then I heard a voice. You let me in. My flashlight flickered as I turned toward the sound. Standing in the doorway to the kitchen was the figure I had seen outside. It was taller than I expected, its body unnaturally thin, with arms that hung too long at its sides. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and the twisted smile grew wider. You shouldn't have looked, it said, its voice a whisper that echoed in my head. I backed away, but my legs felt weak. The figure took a step closer, its movement slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Desperate, I grabbed the fireplace poker and swung it with all my strength, but when it hit, there was nothing there. I don't remember much after that. I woke up the next morning on the floor, the cabin silent and empty. The doors and windows were still locked, but the frost on the kitchen window was marked with a single word, written as if from the outside. Thank you. I left the cabin that day and never went back. Sometimes late at night I still hear that tapping sound, and when I do, I know better than to look out the window. Have you ever experienced something like this? If so, share your story in the comments. And don't go to sleep just yet. The next story is even scarier. The fear I experienced that night is something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. It was so bizarre and terrifying that even now, just thinking about it sends chills down my spine. It all happened on November 2nd, the Day of the Dead. It was a heavy, foggy night, and the silence was so profound it seemed to swallow every sound. I was driving down a deserted road, coming back from a late work meeting. The clock on the dashboard read 11:45 p.m. Out of nowhere, my car stalled. It had never failed me before. I tried starting it again, nothing. Even my phone had no signal. That's when I saw it. Far up on a hill, there was a house. Its silhouette was illuminated by the pale light of the moon. It looked old and abandoned. I didn't have much choice. I needed help. I walked toward the house, my steps slow and hesitant. The air grew heavier with each step, and the fog seemed to cling to me, making it harder to breathe. When I reached the porch, the icy wind made the wooden boards creak beneath my feet. The door, made of worn wood, was slightly ajar. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, revealing a dark, musty interior. The smell hit me immediately, a mix of mold and something metallic, almost like dried blood. Inside, the room was suffocating. My eyes scanned the shadows, revealing old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. Then I saw it. On the far wall hung a large cracked mirror, and in the reflection I saw a tall figure standing in the corner of the room. I spun around immediately, but there was nothing there. My heart pounded as I heard a noise from upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Someone, or something, was walking. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound brave. My voice wavered. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut. The candles on an old chandelier lit up all at once, casting eerie, flickering shadows across the room. Against my better judgment, I climbed the staircase. Each step groaned beneath my weight, as if warning me to turn back. At the top, a dark hallway stretched out before me. Several doors lined the walls, but one stood slightly ajar, with faint, flickering light spilling out. I stepped inside. There, on the floor, sat a child with their back to me, murmuring something incomprehensible, like a prayer or a spell. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely audible. They stopped murmuring. Slowly, they turned to face me. Their face was grotesque, distorted, as if it had been torn apart and sewn back together wrong. Their eyes were hollow, black voids, and their mouths stretched unnaturally wide into a twisted grin. Before I could move, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. When I woke up, I was somewhere else entirely. I was in a long, endless corridor. The walls were lined with old, cracked mirrors. In the reflections, I didn't see myself. I saw a shadowy figure walking toward me, its fiery eyes glowing. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered. the voice echoing inside my head. Then, everything went black. That night changed me forever. Even now, I see things in the mirrors, shadows that shouldn't be there, movements when I'm alone. I've never gone back to that house, but I know a part of me stayed there, and a part of it followed me home. You've probably been through something similar, haven't you? If so, share your experience in the comments. And if you haven't, be careful when you close your eyes. Don't fall asleep just yet, because the next story is even more terrifying. The walk to work. It was a cold and damp morning, Friday the 13th of October, 1900. I still remember every detail of that walk to the factory where I worked. The street was deserted, the fog covered everything, and the only sound I could hear was my boots on the wet ground. I was running late, and I knew my boss wouldn't accept excuses, so I picked up my pace. But as I turned a corner, I saw something that made me stop. There was a woman standing in the middle of the road. She wasn't moving, and something about her seemed deeply wrong. She was wearing a white dress, but it was dirty, as if she had fallen in the mud several times. Her disheveled hair covered half her face, but what I could see was terrifying. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking, and I swear she was staring right at me. I hesitated for a few seconds, my heart pounding, but I kept walking. As I passed her, I heard a whisper. It didn't sound like any language I understood, just strange, unsettling sounds. Then, suddenly she spoke, clearly and directly. "You will die tonight." I froze. I turned around to ask what she wanted, but she was gone. Before I go on, I know you like these stories, so don't forget to subscribe to the channel real quick. That way, you won't miss the next ones. Now, where were we? Oh yes, the strange encounter. I spent the rest of the day trying to forget what had happened. I convinced myself it was just a crazy woman. But something didn't feel right. It was like the air around me was heavier, and her words kept echoing in my head. On my way home, it was already night. The streets were quieter than usual, lit only by the dim light of the street lamps. When I turned the corner to that same street, there she was again. She was standing in the same spot, but now she looked different. Her dress was even dirtier, and her face was more visible. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her eyes, those eyes weren't human. She started walking toward me, slowly but with purpose. I froze. My legs wouldn't move. Then I noticed she was holding something in her hand. It was a knife. The attack. I turned to run, but I tripped on something and fell to the ground. Before I could get up, she was on top of me. Her face was so close I could feel her breath, cold and heavy. "He wants blood," she said, her voice sounding like it came from two places at once. I tried to fight back, but I felt the cold blade pierce my shoulder. The pain was unbearable. "Now you're his," she whispered, smiling in a way I'll never forget. Everything went dark. The awakening. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground. The knife was there, beside me, but she was gone. I looked around, trying to make sense of what had happened. Then I heard it. Not her voice, but something inside me, a whisper that seemed to echo in my mind. "He is with you now." I ran home, locking every door and window. But since that night, I've never been the same. Sometimes I feel like I'm not alone. Sometimes I hear that voice telling me things I don't want to hear. I don't know what happened that night, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Never trust what you see on Friday the 13th. Now as you close your eyes to sleep, I hope you're safe. I hope he isn't watching you too. Good night, and sweet dreams. Oh, and before you go, subscribe to the channel, because maybe, just maybe, it might protect you from something like this. What happened to me on Christmas Eve was so terrifying that I still wonder if it was some kind of warning. It was supposed to be a peaceful, joyful night, but it turned into something I will never forget. It all started when my family decided to spend Christmas at my grandmother's house. It was an old, isolated property in the middle of a snowy forest, a place that always gave me chills, but my grandmother loved it. We arrived late in the afternoon and soon gathered around the fireplace, sharing stories and waiting for dinner. Snow fell heavily outside, covering everything in white. It was the perfect scene until my cousin said something that made me uneasy. You know the legend about this house, right? My grandmother tried to change the subject, but he continued. They say that on Christmas night, someone always knocks on the door. If you open it, it's not who you think it is. We laughed, but the discomfort lingered in the air. The night went on, and around 11:30 p.m., my grandmother said she was going to bed. My cousin and the others started playing games, but I wanted some quiet, so I went to the kitchen to make some hot chocolate. While I was there, I heard something, a faint sound like someone scratching the front door. I froze. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. I took a deep breath and walked to the hallway, leading to the front door. As I got closer, the sound stopped. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things. But then, 3 soft knocks echoed on the wall. Knock, knock, knock. Who's there? I asked, my voice weaker than I intended. No response. I looked through the peephole. Outside, in the snow and darkness, stood a figure. It was a man wearing tattered clothes, an old hat, and a smile that didn't belong on his face. Something about him felt deeply wrong, but what scared me the most were his eyes. They didn't reflect light, they were just black voids. May I come in? He said, with a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My breath caught. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. That's when his smile widened even more, as if he knew I was afraid. I went back to the living room, trying to act calm, but my cousin noticed. What's wrong? He asked. There's someone outside. He immediately got up and went to the door. You're joking, right? He said as he looked through the peephole. There's no one here. My heart stopped. I knew what I had seen. Before I could say anything, the light started flickering. The fireplace, which had been warm and glowing, suddenly went out, plunging the room into cold darkness. That's when we heard it. Footsteps, slowly coming from upstairs. My grandmother was upstairs. Grandma, I called out, but there was no response. We climbed the stairs together, my cousin in front, me right behind him. With every step, the cold grew more intense. When we reached the hallway, we saw her bedroom door wide open. Her bed was empty, and on the wall, written in something that looked like blood, were the words, "He is already here." We ran out of the house that night, leaving everything behind. We never went back. My grandmother was never found, and to this day, when I think about that man outside, I feel like he's still watching me. Now tell me, have you ever experienced something similar? If so, share your story in the comments. And don't go to sleep yet. The next story is even scarier. I never believed in ghost stories, spirits, demons, or haunted houses. They all felt like tales from movies or books, things that couldn't possibly be real. But what happened to me that night proved the world is far scarier than I ever imagined. It was a cold, damp winter night when I got a call from my friend Daniel. He was renovating an old house his family had inherited and needed help sorting through some things. It was a Friday night and I had nothing better to do, so I agreed to go. The house was in an isolated area at the end of a rural road, surrounded by trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. I arrived around 8 p.m., the air already heavy and icy. As I parked, my headlights illuminated the front of the house, an old mansion with broken windows and moss-covered walls. An uneasy feeling crept over me, but I shrugged it off. Daniel greeted me with a smile, but he looked tired. He explained that the house had been in his family for generations, though no one had lived there for decades. It's old, but it has potential, he said with optimism I couldn't share. We started working downstairs, organizing old furniture and boxes filled with papers yellowed by time. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional sound of the wind blowing through the broken windows. Around 10 p.m., Daniel asked me to help carry some boxes up to the attic. We climbed the creaking stairs and reached a small, worn door. When we opened it, the air inside felt different, colder, heavier. The attic was cluttered with old items, trunks, mirrors draped with sheets, broken chairs. There was an eerie feeling in the air, like something unseen was watching us. I heard my great-grandmother used to spend a lot of time here, Daniel said, pushing an old chair aside. They say she died in this room. I swallowed hard. Something about his tone felt more serious than before. As we worked, I heard a sound, a whisper. Did you say something? I asked, looking at Daniel. He shook his head. No. I ignored it. But then it came again, clearer this time. A soft voice, as if someone was speaking from inside the walls. Leave it here. My heart started racing. I glanced at Daniel, but he didn't seem to hear it. A few minutes later, we found a locked box. It was small, made of dark wood with intricate carvings. Daniel tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. It's probably one of my great-grandmother's things, he said. I'll try to open it tomorrow. As he spoke, a chill ran down my spine. Something inside me told me that box should remain shut. Suddenly the lights flickered. The sound of the wind outside grew louder, almost like a howl. I glanced at the window and saw something that froze me in place. A figure. It was a woman in an old-fashioned dress, staring directly at me. Her pale skin and hollow eyes sent a wave of terror through me. Before I could say anything, she vanished. Daniel, we need to leave, I said, my voice trembling. He looked confused but agreed to go downstairs. As we descended the stairs, the whispers grew louder, this time coming from all directions. Why did you bring it here? It's not safe. Daniel started walking faster, but before we reached the ground floor, the attic door slammed shut behind us. Downstairs, the atmosphere was even worse. The air felt thick, and every shadow seemed to move. When we entered the living room, we froze in place. In the middle of the floor was the wooden box, open. Inside was an old pocket watch and a small porcelain doll, with a sinister smile. Did you open this? I asked, my voice barely audible. Daniel shook his head, his face pale. Suddenly, every door and window in the house slammed shut simultaneously. A deafening noise filled the room, as if dozens of voices were screaming at once. The doll in the box slowly turned its head, its lifeless eyes locking onto us. I don't remember how we managed to get out of that house. All I know is that we ran to the car and drove away as fast as we could. The next day, Daniel called me. He sounded feverish, saying he felt like someone was constantly watching him. A few weeks later, he was found dead in his home, with the porcelain doll lying beside his bed. Since that night, I avoid going anywhere near that road. I don't know what really happened in that house, but one thing I know for sure, it holds something that should never be released. If you've ever felt like something was watching you, think twice before ignoring it. Sometimes the unknown is better left undisturbed. And beware of silence. You can hide things you don't want to find. I never believed in ghost stories. I always thought they were exaggerations or made-up tales by bored people. But what happened to me that night completely changed the way I see things. It was a Tuesday, and I was working as a rideshare driver. It was late, close to midnight, and the city was practically empty. The dark and silent streets gave the night an eerie feeling, but I was used to it. I got a new ride request. The pickup location was in a distant neighborhood, a place where the houses were old and the streets were poorly lit. When I arrived at the address, I was surprised to see a woman standing on the sidewalk. She was wearing a simple white dress, her hair cascading over her shoulders. She seemed out of place, almost as if she didn't belong there. She got into the car without saying a word, just nodded and closed the door. Looking at her through the rearview mirror, I asked, "Good evening." "Where to?" She replied in a calm and soft voice. "Please drop me off in front of the cemetery." My first reaction was discomfort. Who goes to a cemetery at this hour? But it was my job, so I didn't question it. I turned on the GPS and headed to the destination. We stayed silent during the ride, staring out the window. The silence in the car was almost unbearable. I tried to make conversation. Are you okay? It's pretty late to be going to the cemetery. She slowly turned her head, looked at me through the mirror, and smiled faintly. Don't worry, I'm used to nice selfish. We arrived at the cemetery gates, an old place with dusty bars and tall trees casting eerie shadows under the moonlight. She asked me to stop. Before stepping out of the car, she turned to me and said, "Thank you for the ride." When I tried to respond, I noticed something strange. The seat where she had been sitting was completely dry, even though her clothes were soaked from the rain. I looked back, but she was gone. She had vanished. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. I got out of the car and looked around, calling for help. But all I could see were tombstones and shadows. The street was deserted and the silence was so deep that even my footsteps sounded too loud. I went back to the car, confused and with my heart racing. I started the engine and drove off, but something felt wrong. My body was trembling, the air felt heavier, and my breathing became uneven. The next day, I couldn't get the experience out of my head. Her image, her enigmatic smile, and the way she disappeared without a trace, it all haunted me. I decided to investigate. I searched online for any news related to the cemetery. That's when I found something that made my blood run cold. A woman, matching her description, had died in a car accident 2 years ago, on the same road I had taken that night. The photo was identical to the passenger I had picked up. At that moment, a wave of fear washed over me, and my body reacted immediately. I started sweating profusely, my vision blurred, and a strong nausea overtook me. I ran to the bathroom, vomiting several times. My whole body felt feverish, as if something was draining me from the inside. In the days that followed, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, that cold and enigmatic smile. I began having nightmares. In one, I was trapped in the cemetery, surrounded by shadows whispering my name. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with my heart pounding like a drum. I stopped walking for a while. Every time I thought about driving again, a chill ran down my spine. A week later, I decided to go back to the cemetery. Something inside me said I needed to face it. When I got there, the place seemed even more sinister than before. I walked through the rusty gates and entered. I wandered between the tombstones, looking for something, anything that could explain what had happened. That's when I saw it. A gravestone with her name on it. The date of her death was exactly 2 years ago, on the same day I gave her a ride. My vision went dark, and my legs gave out. When I came to, I was lying on the ground, feeling as though something was watching me. I ran out of there, swearing never to return. Since that night, every time I'm driving late, I feel like she's still there, sitting in the back seat, watching me through the rearview mirror. Have you ever experienced something like this? If so, share your story. And please, never stop near a cemetery at night. You might not be alone.